There are so many different reasons as to why a movie gets made, but one of the weirder motivations is a good old dollop of spite. Miffed at a studio, channel that into making a movie. Wanting to distance yourself from a previous project, channel that into making a movie. Frustrated at prior creative differences, channel that into making a movie. Fed up with critics constantly lambasting your work, channel that into making a movie. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 horror movies probably made out of spite. Number 10, Friday the 13th. While Sean S. Cunningham is a name forever synonymous with the Friday the 13th franchise, him having helmed the original 1980 movie and all, Cunningham had previously worked heavily on Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left. Serving as a producer on the picture and helping Craven put the story together, old Sean S. was one of the driving forces behind this 1972 offering. But once Last House had been released and received huge backlash due to its controversial content, Sean looked to distance himself to the project as the dust started to settle a few years later. That distancing, of course, came in the shape of Friday the 13th, a film that Cunningham intended to be more of a high-octane rollercoaster ride in response to the grim, depressing, brutal, abusive tale that was The Last House on the Left. Taking inspiration from what John Carpenter had done with Halloween in 1978, Cunningham began plotting a screenplay for what was then known as A Long Night at Camp Blood, which was subsequently rewritten by Victor Miller and became Friday the 13th. Number 9, Red State. The whole production of Kevin Smith's Red State was dripping in spite. First up, the movie was Smith carving up a serious picture clearly designed as a middle finger to those critics and naysayers who'd spent years slamming the filmmaker for falling back on dick and fart jokes far too often. With Red State, the chuckles and toilet humor were replaced with dread and tension. One other way in which Red State was made out of spite, though, comes down to the funding of the film. See, when Bob and Harvey Weinstein, who would finance 7 of Smith's 9 prior features, refused to fund Red State, Smith dug in his heels and decided to push forward with the movie using alternative backing. And of course, on a third hand, Red State was also clearly made despite infamous pastor Fred Phelps and his Westboro Baptist Church hate group. In Michael Parks' Pastor Cooper, Smith gave audiences a figure modeled in the image of Phelps, with Cooper leading the charge of the crazed extremist 5 Points Trinity Church. As for the film itself, though, it wasn't bad. Number 8, The Return of the Living Dead. What do you do when you split with your writing partner and the director of one of the most influential films in the history of horror? Why, you set about taking the remaining assets that you have and making your own movie to stick it to your old buddy. That was essentially the case with The Return of the Living Dead. Previously, John Russo had co-written the seminal Night of the Living Dead with George A. Romero. When the pair finally went their separate ways, though, Romero continued on to eventually make Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, and Survival of the Dead. Having seen the success of Dawn and with Day in development, Russo decided to hatch his own venture back into the world of the shuffling undead. With the rights to the Living Dead title to his name, John began to put together what would become 1985's funny as hell The Return of the Living Dead. And interestingly, Return does reference and acknowledge Night of the Living Dead as a movie that exists within this world, but to throw shade in the direction of that film, Return reveals that Night of the Living Dead was wrong in its depiction of its ghouls, with characters are literally saying that the flick quote-unquote got things wrong and that this was how they were supposed to be. Number 7, Predator. Rather than the entire movie being made in spite, it's the gun-toting antics of 1987's Predator that was included as a shot for those demanding guns, guns, and more guns. Given the premise of the picture, director John McTiernan was obviously already planning to have plenty of bullets being fired by Dutch and his military rescue buddies. Still, there was plenty of noise from 20th Century Fox that McTiernan needed to include even more guns in this 87 offering. Those notes from the producers resulted in a laughable amount of sweat-soaked muscle and machismo trigger action in the final film. As McTiernan says during the Predator commentary track, quote, "What I was really doing was to quietly ridicule the desire to see pictures of guns firing," end quote, with him pointing out how he purposefully had Dutch and his crew firing off ridiculous amounts of rounds and managing not to hit a single thing. The filmmaker would also add how some people had an almost quote-unquote pornographic desire when it comes to seeing weapons being unloaded on the silver screen. And for those people who get hot under the collar at such things, Predator was very much hard XXX material. Number 6. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddys Revenge. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is a movie that producer Robert Shaye was laser focused to make, regardless of whether those who had made the original Elm Street work so well were interested in it or not. Of course, Wes Craven had helmed A Nightmare on Elm Street and Robert Englund had starred as Freddy Krueger. For Shaye though, he didn't give a single crap what either of those men thought when it came to a sequel. Now it wasn't spite that initially drove Elm Street 2. As ever, it was the prospect of cold hard cash. In fact, the only reason the slightly ropey final scene of the original 1984 Elm Street exists in the first place is because Shaye came up with that idea as a way to open the door for a follow-up. As for Freddy's Revenge, Shaye pushed on with the film after Craven said how stupid the movie's premise was. Even worse, the producer brought in director Jack Shoulder and started shooting with an unnamed extra in a plastic Freddy Krueger mask, all because Shaye was too arrogant to make a respectful offer to Robert Englund. Miffed at Craven's disinterest and unwilling to pay Englund what he was worth, Bob Shaye didn't care one jot. Well, that was until the fake Freddy looked absolutely awful and he was forced to offer more money to bring Englund back. Number 5. Godzilla. While it may not be an entire movie made out of spite, 1998's Godzilla is well worthy of a spot on this list for how two characters were included solely as a way to take a jibe at a couple of critics who'd previously panned certain other Roland Emmerich pictures. The couple of critics in question are of course the legendary duo of Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, with Emmerich rewriting the initial screenplay to include the characters of Mayor Ebert and his assistant Gene. Yeah, that is not subtle at all. Both of these figures are of course idiots who make horrendous decisions at every turn in the film. And this was all done as a way for the director to lash out at the real-life Siskel and Ebert after the duo had slammed Emmerich's Universal Soldier, Stargate, and Independence Day. So, what was the reaction of Siskel and Ebert to their Godzilla doppelgangers? Well, they were disappointed that Emmerich didn't give them some grand death, which was just one of many problems the pair had with the film. Number 4. Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. By all accounts, Rob Zombie hated working on his Halloween remake. As a major fan of John Carpenter's iconic 1978 picture, Zombie was stoked to be asked to helm the redo of The Night He Came Home. But unfortunately for old Rob, making this remake was utter hell. Eventually convinced to return for sequel Halloween 2, Zombie tried to stick it to the Weinstein Company by going all out batcrap crazy with this sequel. Refusing to buckle to the constraints put on him in the first movie, the director intentionally went balls to the wall bonkers with this follow-up as a way to overcome studio pressure and finally do his own thing with the series. It's also worth noting though that Zombie and John Carpenter themselves had a falling out prior to the 2007 Halloween. Well, kind of. Upon being offered the chance to remake Halloween, Zombie called the legendary horror master to ask for his permission to take the gig. The initial story that came out was that Carpenter was happy for Rob to tackle the do-over, encouraging him to make it his own. In later years though, Zombie had said how cold and rude JC was with him, while JC called Zombie a lying piece of shit, which you would have to imagine spurred the Rocker to further take his Halloween pictures in the creative direction that he did. Fortunately, the two buried the hatchet in 2016 and are now apparently on good terms. Number 3. The Lords of Salem. Another entry, another splash of Rob Zombie. Released in 2013, Zombie's The Lords of Salem was what it was due to the rocker-turned-director's pained experiences on his 2 Halloween pictures. See, Zombie hasn't been shy about saying how miserable a time he had with that first Halloween effort, and he originally wasn't going to return for that movie's follow-up. Promised a better working environment though and more freedom, the White Zombie frontman would eventually agree to helm Halloween 2, only to then have an even worse time on that than its predecessor. Frustrated, disillusioned, and adamant that he wasn't going to return for the Weinstein Company's planned Halloween 3D, Zombie was happy to take up an offer from Jason Blum, particularly as Blum's offer was for Rob to have complete creative control on a supernatural horror film. Revisiting a kernel of an idea that he'd had years prior, Zombie ended up crafting his tale of a troubled radio DJ who becomes entangled with a coven of Satan worshippers. Assembling an impressive ensemble featuring Sherry Moon Zombie, Meg Foster, Bruce Davison, Dee Wallace, Barbara Crampton, Patricia Quinn, Ken Forey, and Jeff Daniel Phillips, The Lords of Salem, while not perfect, was a welcome upgrade on the dross that was Halloween 2. Number 2. Alien Covenant. For fans of the Alien franchise, one thing that has forever irked them is how Newt and Hicks were quietly killed off screen during the opening minutes of the much maligned Alien 3. So, when District 9 director Neil Blomkamp started loose work on a new Alien film that would bring these characters back and ignore Alien 3 and Alien Resurrection, well, that was something that immediately caught the attention of everyone. The director spent 2 years structuring what his Alien 5 would look like, and some stunning pieces of concept art eventually made their way online. Unfortunately, this all took place in the aftermath of Ridley Scott's Prometheus being released. At the time, Scott had already talked up a sequel to Prometheus, with the plan being to further explore the engineers by following the journey of Noomi Rapace's Elizabeth Shaw. Once news of Blomkamp's Alien picture became public though, Scott and 20th Century Fox had a major change of plan for their Prometheus follow-up. Rather than what we were promised, Prometheus Paradise Lost became Alien Covenant. Way more in tune with the style and palette of the first 2 Alien movies, this became an entirely different film, to the point that poor Noomi Rapace is reduced to a blink and you'll miss her role in the theatrical cut. The pivot of Alien Covenant could also be a response or an overcorrection to Prometheus's critics as well. As for Neil Blomkamp's Alien 5, well, that has since been shelved, with Fox seemingly choosing to keep Ridley Scott sweet rather than bring back Ripley, Newt, and Hicks. Number 1. Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood was made as a way to show New Line Cinema what they were missing out on. At this point, the Friday the 13th franchise was owned by Paramount Pictures, and Paramount had approached New Line about doing a crossover movie with Freddy Krueger and the Elm Street series. Given how the Nightmare on Elm Street films were bringing home nearly twice as much profit as their F-13 counterparts at that point though, New Line couldn't come to what they deemed a suitable agreement with Paramount. In response to this, Paramount set about showing that there was still plenty of life and, most importantly, box office interest in Jason Voorhees. And thus an executive producer pushed ahead with a new Friday the 13th picture that put Voorhees up against the telekinetic powers of Tina Shepard in a Jason vs. Carrie-esque battle. And for what it's worth, The New Blood took home $19.1 million from a $2.8 million budget, whereas A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 The Dream Master, released that same year, made just shy of $50 million from its $6.5 million budget. It would, of course, take a further 15 years before we'd finally get Freddy vs. Jason, which was only possible once New Line purchased the rights to the Friday the 13th franchise.